even beyond the 19th Amendment, African American women didn't necessarily get the right to vote immediately. We had that right taken from us, especially in the South, by all manner of trickery, including poll taxes, grandfather clause, et cetera. I can get into that more with the question and answering. And basically, we had Black women who participated in that long struggle for suffrage even after the 19th Amendment. So I don't want us to leave here today thinking the 19th Amendment was a clear victory for all women. Black women had to fight in some areas up to 1970 to get the right to vote, especially in places in the Deep South and things like that. Some particular people that I think you should, keep in mind when you're thinking about this longer struggle of suffrage for Black women. Septima Clark comes to mind. And Septima Clark and her citizenship schools in South Carolina, she was a civil rights activist and educator. And what she did is she was an innovator of a unique model of activism called the Citizenship School. And citizenship schools were basically schools or classes that she held for adult learners. And she basically not only taught them to read and write, but also taught them their basic rights as American citizens alongside of their formal education. And so these citizenship schools were so transformative that not only did she teach people their basic rights, but those people were brought into the civil rights struggle because the urgency of now, the urgency of the right to vote. In addition to that, you have activists like Ella Baker, who is an unsung heroine of the civil rights movement, just like Septima Clark. Ella Baker was the mentor for Rosa Parks. And Ella Baker, just like Septima Clark, believed that strong people didn't need strong leaders. And so a hairdresser or someone who had never voted was just as critical in the right or in this movement as the ministers and some of the more PhD types of people. And so all of that goes into this larger history. And it just shows that the periodization that we traditionally think of when we think of Black women and the right to vote is a lot longer for us. It's a lot more complex, a lot more nuanced, and the fight continues onward to today. Thank you. That's all I really have to say about this.
Well, Professor, that was actually, it's kind of funny. It seems like we may have organized our discussion, but we really didn't. But you touched on so many things that I'm also planning to touch on, but in a slightly different way. And so I really appreciate your comments. I had some comments prepared, and I'm still going to do some of them. But last night, watching the debate, put some things in my mind, and I think some things really resonated with it. And one of the things that just really struck me was we watched two women on the stage. There were two women on the stage, one white, one Black, with having to deal with a man who pretty much ignored and interrupted and talked over them repeatedly as if what they were, and then, didn't answer the moderator's questions, and I saw so much commentary about it afterwards. And I think a lot of women felt like, that's me. We're used to that feeling of being in a room with a man who mansplains to us and talks over us and feels perfectly comfortable doing that. And I think it was interesting to me because it showed that how white women and women of color are often in the same boat in many respects, that we have to deal with some of the same things. Although, even though we have to function in that same space, our experiences and our backgrounds are often very different. And the experiences we have with that are sometimes different. We bring in different perspectives. And one of the things that I think we must continue working on is understanding those perspectives and that it's not all the same. And I think, for example, as a Black woman on the stage, there was a very different dynamic there for Kamala Harris than there was for Susan Page. But there are also so many similarities. And so as I've been thinking about this conversation, I've of course been thinking a lot about my dad, Nathaniel Jones, and how he would be looking at this, and how he's talked about especially the intersectionality of Black women and the feminist movement and the right to vote. And his experience was interesting, and that's one reason, Professor, what you said really resonated, because he often talked about the influence that his mother had on him, and largely because of the work she did with local civic organizations, with the local Y. She was on, it was a segregated Y, but she was on all these committees, and every week they had civic programs and speeches. They brought people in, and he would go, and he just was fascinated. And that's when he first became interested in the NAACP and learning about answering the call. And that was African-American women in his life who were very engaged in civic activity. So that, when you talked about that, it was just something that I thought he would be listening and just nodding and thinking about his own experience. And that is the experience of Black women in that movement is, again, it's a very mixed, as you mentioned, it's a mixed bag. You mentioned Mary Church Terrell, and one thing I'd like to share is that she wrote a letter right after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And she wrote a letter to the president of the NAACP. And she expressed concern that without action, even with the passage of the 19th Amendment, that African-American women would still not be able to have their 15th Amendment rights protected. And she said, of the 19th Amendment of the basis line. She understood that the 19th Amendment did guarantee to some women the right to vote, but Black women would still, in many parts of the country, have to fight for it. And even though, as you mentioned, Black women were very involved in the civic life of the community, many of them often, even though they could have influence over their husbands, many of their husbands had no influence. Their husbands couldn't vote. Their households, even before the 19th Amendment, their households had no franchise. Whereas with white women, and I'm certainly not downplaying not having the effect of not having the right to vote, but their households were represented in the voting booth, and that is something that African American women have had to struggle with over time, of both fighting a system, but also trying to at least even have equality within their own homes, even if their husbands were not the problem. You also mentioned all of these women in the movement, and one thing that's very sad is so many of them have been lost to history. We don't hear about them. We don't know about them. And they were so instrumental, not just in the how effective the movement was, but they were strategists. They were, these things did not happen just willy-nilly. There was a lot of strategy, a lot of planning, and so many women were involved in that and were instrumental in the, especially, for example, in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. One wonderful thing I've had in my life is I got to know Dr. Dorothy Height very well. And Dr. Height was the president of the National Conference of Negro Women. And she was just this amazing person. And she was one of the few women who was in the inner core of the top leadership of the civil rights movement. About how hard that was, how she had to constantly jump for position and constantly had to, but she gave me a piece of advice that I thought was wonderful. She said, one thing that's very important is always stand in the middle of the picture. They can't cut you out. And that's what, she had to constantly think about, how am I going to, not only how am I going to do my job, but how do I make sure I'm not marginalized and I'm not cut out. And that made me think, again, going back to the debate last night, of how women, women of all races, but particularly minority women, have to do so many things at the same time while just doing our job. We can't just do our job. We have to then constantly weigh and balance. And I think a perfect example, again, going back to another debate, is the debate in 2016 between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, when he was hulking behind her. We all remember when he was, kind of prowling behind her. And she wrote in her book, she said, no matter where I walked, he followed me closely, staring at me, making faces. It was incredibly uncomfortable. He was literally breathing down my neck. My skin crawled. And she said she wished she could have hit pause and asked the audience how to react. But she said, do you stay calm, keep smiling, and carry on as if he were repeatedly invading as if he weren't repeatedly invading your space? Or do you turn, look him in the eye, and say loudly and clearly, back up, you creep, get away from me. I know you love to intimidate women, but you can't intimidate me, so back up. And then she said, and this actually is very sad. She said, maybe I have overlearned the lesson of staying calm, biting my tongue, digging my fingernails into a clenched fist. And when I read that, it kind of broke my heart, because I thought, even now, she's second guessing her choice of what to do. She had to, in that moment, in real time, decide how she was going to handle this situation. And no matter what she did, she would have been judged. She would have been judged harshly. But she's still saying, well, maybe I should have done it differently. And I think that's something that we all have to deal with. We've all been in those rooms where there's some microaggression or something is said or some issue comes up, and we have to think, what do I do about this? How do I handle it? Do I say something? Well, or do I not say anything? And if I don't say anything, am I being a pushover? And on top of that, another thing we always have to worry about is, am I making it harder for the people who come behind me? Am I not owning up to, what I should be doing in this space to keep the door open? But if I do say something, how will that be perceived? How will that be? And I thought, and we have to do all of that while still being there, present in the meeting, doing whatever it is we have to do. We have to keep doing our jobs while having to manage all of this. And again, I think that's something that's very common, but, that most women have to deal with. But there's an extra layer when it comes to African American women, because we're thinking about not just our gender, but also our race. And one thing I found very troubling in a lot of the conversations is I don't think there's a full understanding of that additional layer. And I think it's important for people to understand, especially when trying to consider how women of color have to navigate through all of this, is that we do have that additional layer. And if we're saying this is a problem, it is not helpful to say, no, you're overreacting. You're overreacting to that, or I don't have that problem. So therefore, what does race have to do with it? What is, but still expecting there to be a respect for the obstacles and challenges that women encounter because of our gender. I think it's just really critical that we have these kinds of conversations. That's one reason I'm so appreciative of the center. I like to say the Jones Center. I like to say that as often as I can, that we do have these kinds of honest conversations and can understand the different perspectives and have a deeper insight into the things that all the different nuances, especially that minority women have to deal with on top of gender issues. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Those comments were really brilliant, and I really thank you for passing on. Dorothy Hyde is one of my heroes, and I thank you for passing on that bit of advice about, yes, because I'm always the one on the edge or whatever else. And I've had friends at PWIs that have been cut out of pictures, and yeah, that I'm going to take that advice. So. Did I lose somebody here? I think I lost.
No, you are here. We're here.
Oh, okay. Okay. Good. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right about Kamala last night. I mean, a lot of my friends texted me, well, what do you think? She could have said more. And I said, we all know what it means to be a Black woman and crush it. We're crushed under the weight of this angry Black woman stereotype. So I think there is nothing else she could have done last night to come back at him or to try to, break him down. I mean, because she's running the risk of how many people invoke the angry Black woman stereotype, sometimes even other Black people. So I think she was very powerful and very direct, but she also was still very likable. And it's really sad that we do have to carry those sorts of self-conscious behaviors, even in a debate. It could be in a local debate, running for office locally. And so this is something that Black women entering the political arena have to grapple with. And I don't think that it is necessarily something other women don't have to grapple with, but because of the angry Black woman stereotype, we're fighting against so much more.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting, just even listening to some of the commentary related to the debate I heard several commentators say, well, Kamala's going to have to do this so that she doesn't come across as angry. But they always prefaced it or had a caveat of, well, that's not fair. That's a different standard. It's a double standard that she's going to be held to, but that's the way, that's unfortunately the way it is. And I thought, well, maybe that's progress, because 4 years ago, they didn't even have the caveat. They just said it and moved on. So, but I thought, okay, well, at least now when they hold her to a completely different standard, they at least admit we're holding her to a completely different standard. It's not that helpful, but maybe that's progress.
Yeah, when I look back at history, at all the Black women who dared to try to get into the political arena, either starting with Maria Stewart, who in 1831 became the first woman of any race to speak in public. And her speech was very political and very had elements of Black nationalism. And she risked her life to do it. But, I'd moved from her to Ida B. Wells, who had a price on her head, to Mary Church Terrell, to even Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, and what they had to sacrifice and what they were up against, even speaking assertively and even having the audacity to pursue a political position. So, I mean, Kamala's inheriting all of that, more than a century of legacy. And I think, she speaks to that. That's one of the things I really like about her. She's very conscious of her legacy. She's also very conscious of the intersectionalities and her being a child of immigrants and then all the nuances of Black ethnicity and what that means. And because she's different than maybe you or I in terms of her ethnicity. But it's just really remarkable how people have the political fortitude to enter a sphere that is going to absolutely be murder to their psyches, death threats in addition. And so, it's something we hardly ever talk about.
And it's interesting that she also embraces all of it. Like you're saying, she deals with it and she embraces all of it, and she embraces all aspects of herself and doesn't carve anything out. And I do hear other people try to carve, well, you're not African American, you didn't descend from slaves, you're not part of the you're not really Black, but she's very clear on what she sees herself as, and she doesn't see that they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah, definitely.
And for us, especially as we move into a time where we are so much more multicultural, and we're not as, everyone is not, in terms of ethnicity, it's not as clear cut. And and I think that's an important lesson to people.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, people, there's this debate. I think some of the audience people may know about the American descendants of slaves, and that I think that's the sentiment that you're speaking of. And I say Kamala, who, as she says, grew up in Oakland and is affiliated with big time Black institutions, including Alpha Kappa Alpha and also Howard University. I mean, it's undeniable. She might, in fact, be more Black American than me.
Hmm.
Because you know what I mean? She's definitely Black. But are there any questions from the audience or?
We, yes, thank you both. It's just great to, can you hear me? It's great to hear you both. It's great to hear you both and see you both talking to each other about this. And we are, I just sent out another message for people to send messages over the chat questions. But I actually wanted to, kind of jump in on this conversation if I could, because, Kamala Harris has been a really important figure too to Asian Americans, because she is biracial and part South Asian American, and it's really the sort of Asian Americans as a sort of political constituency are very, very divided, as we know. But I think that when I've heard her speak, like not in person, but when I've heard her speak about sort of her background as a South Asian American biracial woman, it's a really I think she raises the issues in a really important and interesting way to talk about race, and also sort of like a non-essentialized kind of ways. And I just really appreciate that about her. I actually had a question about, and this is for both of you, but Stephanie, I know that you do so much work with voter protection, especially right now. What kinds of things, there's so many efforts to sort of exclude all kinds of people from voting, mostly Black and Brown people. And maybe if we could talk a little bit about some of what kinds of efforts have been undertaken more recently, and how they might be similar to things that have gone on historically in the past.
Hmm. Well, thanks, Emily. That's such a great question because this is part of a continuum. And what we're seeing, the kind of voter suppression efforts that we're seeing are they're different in many ways, but it is part of the same pattern. In fact, it's interesting you raise this question because I'm working with the NAACP on voter protection and training lawyers, and we have a training tonight. And one of the things that I've had included in the training is a history stemming from the passage of the 15th Amendment through the 1900s, with the various types of voter suppression, literacy tests, and poll taxes, and then a discussion about Voting Rights Act, and then Shelby, to show that what we're dealing with now is not that different than what we were dealing with before. These are not one-offs. It's not just this random accidental, we've just been trying to protect our election systems, and just some people end up not being able to vote. Sorry. No, this is all part of the same scheme. So we're seeing a lot of things now that I find very interesting, that a few years ago, when people were trying to get these measures passed, the argument always was that they were protecting the election system. They were protecting it from illegal voters. They didn't want people who weren't supposed to be voting to vote. And that was always the argument. But now that they're actually implementing them, it has nothing to do with stopping ineligible voters from voting. It's always about stopping people who are eligible to vote, who are registered to vote, have every right to cast a ballot. It stops them from voting by playing gotcha with them. And so this has nothing to do with protecting the system. It's all designed to keep certain people from voting. But it raises an interesting issue, because when a lot of these measures were being put into place, we urged, especially women, to help us, to help fight these, because these were dangerous. And a lot of I just don't think that that especially white women and white feminist organizations they didn't lean in on this as much, because I think they didn't see this as directly affecting them. That this is not, these women still were going to be able to vote. They didn't have any trouble getting ID. They'd be able to vote. They would, their polling places, they weren't going to have to wait in line forever. But now I think they're seeing that even though it doesn't directly affect them in terms of their ability to vote, it's affected the ability of people who would have voted for people who would protect their rights. So, as we're seeing, with what's going on with the Supreme Court, for example, and people are saying, how did this happen? Well, this actually happened a few years ago. You just weren't paying attention. It's kind of late now to try to fight it. But when you allow the suppression of Black and brown votes, it doesn't just affect Black and brown people. And so it's really important that we are much more vigilant, that everyone is much more vigilant. And it's something I encourage all women to pay attention to, that even if none of these measures are going to stop you from voting and you won't have any trouble voting, it is going to stop people from voting. And those people would be instrumental in putting people in office who would protect your rights. And I don't think that's talked about enough.
Yeah, thank you. Emily, that's a really great question. And I think for me, how I would respond to that, I'll draw the really concrete parallels. So after the Civil War, after the failure of Reconstruction, there were these poll taxes where people had to pay a certain amount of money for the right to vote. And so when we see what's happening in at least 5 to 7 states where people have fines, and because they have fines, they were being denied the right to vote. So to me, that's an equivalent, or at least a good parallel to the poll tax. After the Reconstruction, they had something called citizenship tests. And what happened was people would come on election day and they would have to not only read, but also interpret sections of the Constitution. Now, if you've read the Constitution, there are sections I cannot interpret. So to have somebody who could barely or may not be able to read and write interpret it, then that was a problem, because a lot of Black people, a lot of poor people couldn't pass that test. So I guess a parallel today is the naturalized citizenship test and all these questions about citizenship, that are coming up, like who is and who isn't a citizen. And, if you lived in Canada for a while, then are you still an American citizen? Another thing that I see a parallel with, and it's really disturbing to me on so many levels, I stay up at night about this. There is some violence and threats of violence that our president and some of his surrogates have implied. Violence at the polls. At the very least, I believe on election day, people will show up with guns, just like they did after Reconstruction, to try to intimidate people from voting or to intimidate into voting a certain way. So that is a very eerie parallel. In addition, after the civil rights and Reconstruction, the collapse of Reconstruction, there was this idea of who has a right to vote. There were behavior tests. Like if you had a child out of wedlock, if you had, not come to work or something like that, then the whites in powers in the South would take away your right to vote. So it's like bad behavior. So we have that with the, if you're a felon, if you had been convicted of a felony, then you don't have the right to vote. One of the most undemocratic things that I think, that is related to democracy, you've paid your time, you've done your time in jail, you come out and for something you did as a kid or, a bad decision you make, you never again have the right to vote. It's heinous and it's un-American. And so that's another parallel. I'm seeing a lot of confusing instructions. So just like after Reconstruction, there are all these different instructions, the 7-box ballot box where, you had to figure out as a newly freed person, which slip of paper to put in which box. We have a lot of confusing instructions being attached to voting now, even voting by mail. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I thought the DC ballot was a little confusing. And so these are the things that people are faced with that have remarkable similarities. The last thing I'm going to talk about is voter apathy. So there's a spirit, and it's been going on a while, right? Where people are kind of encouraging, it's like a self-fulfilling thing where people say, oh, our vote doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. That's not going to end racism. It's not going to end police killing us. It's not going to end poverty in our communities. And so it just feels so overwhelming and so hopeless that, you know, that apathy, you know, maybe makes people stay at home. That's also something that happened after Reconstruction. So, you know, it's just really sad. There are not that many things I can say that are a direct parallel to the 19th century, but this is the right to vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another thing, when you talk about apathy, that is a real concern, not just the apathy of it's not going to matter, but the apathy of, well, even if it matters, if I vote, it's not going to get counted. It's not going to get counted, or my vote's going to be stolen, or it doesn't matter what the votes are, he's going to steal it, which I think is a lot of the strategy there is to gin this up so that people just think it won't matter. It's going to be a mess. One of the things we're struggling with is making sure we get the message out that voting is really important and that you should do it and that we will protect you without making people feel like they're going to be Ruby Bridges, you know, on election day and have to have, you know, federal marshals and lawyers walking them into the polls. That for most people, voting is not going to be difficult if they know what to do. Like all of these things that you're talking about, Professor, that you know, they're just so complicated, and that's in many instances that's intentional to make it as hard as possible. But if people know what to do, they can do it, and I think that's one thing that makes it different than what we saw in the 20th century. You know, counting the bubbles in a bar of soap or the number of jelly beans in a jar, where there was no way to do it. All of the obstacles that have been put in people's way now can be overcome. We just don't, but it's information. They need to have that information. But in order to gather that information, they have to not feel as if it's not going to matter. And I think that's also one of the purposes of calling out the militia, so that people will feel like, well, I'm not going over there. I just, it's too dangerous. And in that way, if you do that, you don't have to cheat. If you can keep people from showing up. So I think it's just really important that that we keep spreading that message that there are things that are the same, but have an empowerment message that if you know what to do, and frankly, that's something I'm seeing women women are very involved in that, of really pressing that message and organizing. And the Greek organizations are, for example, I mean, they're out in force. The AKAs and the Deltas, and then the Links, and so many organizations they're doing voter registration and voter protection and voter empowerment. And it goes right back to what you were talking about the role of women in civic life generally, but in voting in particular.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I've got a question here from our own Dean Williams, and co-founder, I should add, of the Jones Center back in 2010. And she asks, what accounts for the lack of robust protection for the right to vote, considering how many people put their lives on the line to secure the right to vote through the 15th, 19th, and 19th Amendments and the Voting Rights Act? That's the end of the question.
Hi, Dean Williams. It's been quite some time, but I remember you from University of Cincinnati. But I guess I'm not sure what she means by the lack of protection. I don't know if you could clarify that question, and you might be better suited to answer that anyway. Oh, okay, constitutional protection. I just think that there's not a will, in our government. There's not a will at the hands of the state, either at the local, the state, or the federal level, to protect that right. It's not, our vote is not sacred. It just isn't. Not, vis-a-vis our relationship to the state is what I mean by that. And so I think, it's just, I think, in terms of the community, I think not as many of, it just seems that maybe some of the younger generations or those who haven't had a lot of history don't really understand those sacrifices. And so, that's the best I can answer that. What do you think, Stephanie?
I think you're right. I think that's a huge part of it. I also think that, unfortunately, over the past few decades, voting and fair, the right to vote has been turned into a political issue. That much like masks, now, wearing a mask is considered to be a liberal democratic kind of thing, and it's been politicized to a ridiculous degree. And what I found is when it comes to voting rights, that is often seen as political. And I think it's because we're talking about protecting, the rights of minorities to vote. So that's seen as, well, that's a particular political bloc. And, therefore it must be partisan, and I find that even in just talking with, for example, businesses and encouraging them to get involved in, get out the vote activities, nonpartisan get out the vote activities, and encouraging registration and encouraging early voting, their first reaction is, well, I don't want to get involved in politics. We don't want to get, and we have to explain, no, this isn't political. This is, this applies to everyone. But I think, some people have done a really good job of turning that into, and they do it for a reason, because I think they do feel like, if a certain group of people are very robust voters, that means that they most likely will be voting a certain way, and certain other folks will not remain in power. And so it's treated as a political thing, for self-preservation. But I also think that there's a real lack of understanding of a lot of this history. And in the media, I mean, even when you listen to some of the discussions about it, you just shake your head. It's so shallow. People don't understand Shelby, for example, and what happened. And I think if you just draw the timeline and look at like the day after Shelby came down, how these measures started being put into place, it was, but many commentators accepted the Supreme Court's bizarre argument that this wasn't necessary anymore, even though as soon as Shelby came down, we saw immediately why Section 5 and Section 4 were necessary. So I just think it's really complicated, and I think it's a combination of things, and we just have, I think a lot of it is we have to do a lot more public education. And I'll add one more thing: lack of civic education in the schools. So people just don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. That last part, especially lack of civic education, not just understanding that the right to vote is probably the most important of our citizenship rights, and especially for people who have been marginalized, stepped upon. So I think it's an important right for all people, but particularly women, people of color, people who immigrated to this country, to exercise that right and to ensure that it's protected. But I think there's no will to try to protect this or make it a little bit more strong in the Constitution or through some other amendment or other act, is because power doesn't want to concede anything to people who have been historically, locked out of power. So they're not going to concede or give us even an inch. We're going to have to take it. And we're going to have to take it in each election, not just the presidential election, even those little local, small municipal elections. We have to seize that power through our vote every election. We also have to do a better job with the political consciousness raising. I mentioned Septima Clark and Ella Baker, and I never followed through on that point. These women were in the trenches, really educating our community about what our rights are and why the Constitution is so important to protect all of our rights, but especially the right to vote.
Those are such great answers. I'm sorry, I'm going to take my moderator prerogative here and just jump in and add to that your answers. That I think part of it too is it's not just lack of political will. It's political will designed to roll back the gains of all of our civil rights movements. So this sort of decades long effort to create this colorblind approach to discrimination and to thinking about race has been, I think, like a really concerted, coordinated effort to kind of like make sure, right, that people think that we don't need these kinds of protections anymore, and that in fact, if you try to offer these protections, right, you're racist, right? So it's so the sort of civic education involved is not just sort of civic education and about sort of the history of the movement, but it's also you've got to like fight, you've got to undo some of this, ideological stuff. I'm not sure if Kristen has any questions to ask, but if she doesn't, I'll ask another one. So,
I could go in.
Oh, okay, good. You go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, I'm also just jumping in because I have the ability to do that because I wanted to follow up on a couple of the really excellent points that just made. So on the civic education issue, so last spring when I thought the banners were coming, I was teaching my feminist jurisprudence class. And so I specifically included a section on the 19th Amendment, but we were looking at it very much from an intersectional perspective. And to a person, these are law students, well-educated students, knew next to nothing about the movement for the 19th Amendment, any of the issues that were surrounding it, as well as all the other movements that were very related to it was kind of just all news. I'm going to put a plug in for the class that I mentioned during the welcome that's posted up on our center website, because the students also have talked, for example, about the really important role of LGBTQ persons in these voter rights movements also. And of course, for the 19th Amendment, they were oftentimes participating without acknowledging their LGBTQ status, but that there were a lot of folks who came together in kind of a coalition realizing these important rights, although it also points out lots of the schisms that happened and the necessity, I think, for healing a lot of that and going forward. I also just wanted to mention, I've been a poll observer, I don't know for how many years, and you have to be trained in a 3-hour training, which I participated in last night. And I cannot tell you, half of the training was talking about what to do in situations where they're fully expecting a lot of really potentially violent, very much interference at the polls. And it was just really disconcerting to realize that, the same training I took a couple of years ago was not quite at this level of voter intimidation. But I also think one of the opportunities here, trying to find anything positive about what's going on, I think a lot of people who did not think that voter intimidation or these issues were their issues have had their eyes opened with, I've heard so many people say, they feel like we are, living in a totally different kind of a country where, and it's like, well, that's been the case for a whole lot of people for a whole lot of time. So, potentially the consciousness raising that's happened around this of really um, how people in the right positions can really do things that totally can affect, for example, a presidential election. I think that more people are hearing that message now than have ever before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this time around, and I'm like you, Kristen. I've been involved in this every year, every election year, and it's different this time. What we're talking about is different. What we're warning people about is different, um, and and it's really troubling. It's frightening, and I think one of the reasons this is happening is because we have people actually in government, in the highest levels of government, who are encouraging this kind of thing. It used to be it was coming from elsewhere and it just wasn't being addressed properly and it wasn't being curtailed or deterred. Now you've got the president of the United States publicly calling on this over and over again. And you're seeing, now this is nothing new to see, secretaries of state and, state election officials playing around with things. But for example, in Ohio, Frank LaRose, who first started off saying, well, I'd like to have more than one drop box per county, but the law won't let me, so I can't. And so then the first court said, no, actually the law allows you to have more than one drop box per county. And he said, well, if only someone would give me permission to have more than one drop box per county, I would do it. And then another court says, no, the law allows you to do it. And he says, I just don't know what to do. I can't do it. My hands are tied. And it's obvious that he's doing the same thing that a lot of people are doing. He's just not sounding as obnoxious about it, but it's all part of the same effort. That's not necessarily new. We've seen that in past years, but it's a much more, I think, concerted effort, and it's getting a lot more support among people who are very powerful. And then that's leading to people posing all of these doomsday scenarios, most of which I think are not going to happen. They're not even workable, sort of like the legislatures are going to take over and appoint their own electors. There's lots of reasons why I don't think that's even feasible. But the fact that it's being talked about, then I think tamps down the vote. That makes people feel like, oh, see, it's not going to matter. We can vote and we can vote and we can vote. In the end, it's going to be stolen. So, why go through the trouble? And in the past, you could kind of convince people like, well, it's not that much trouble. Just go vote. It's, vote anyway. It's not. But now they're thinking, well, it's COVID and it's lines and there are going to be people out there with guns. Like, this is not that simple anymore. So we just have to keep, I think we just have to keep people focused and keep making sure they understand why it matters, and that if their vote didn't matter, people wouldn't be working so hard to keep them from voting. Obviously, their vote matters.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to pose a question from Janelle. Knowing how hard it is for women in the political sphere, should we still encourage women to run for office? Is risking their mental, physical health worth it? Or should we direct our efforts elsewhere?
I think the answer is yes, definitely. I don't think it's, I don't even think there's a question. Yeah. And, as hard as it is now, I always, and, just harking back to my dad, whenever I would get really discouraged and frustrated, he would say, you think this is bad? Imagine what this was like. Once he said to me after an election that didn't go the way I wanted, he said, you think this is awful? Imagine how we felt in 56 when Adlai Stevenson lost for the second time. And we didn't have a Voting Rights Act, and we didn't have a Civil Rights Act, and we didn't have Black mayors and governors and senators all around the country. Yeah, this isn't ideal, but, it sort of was like, get over yourself. Like we need to, it's hard, but it is nothing like what, as Professor Taylor was talking about, what some of these women went through. And they couldn't even run for office. They were going through this just to vote or just to organize people to vote. And they were facing so much more than any woman now has to face. So I just think that, it's hard and it's not fair, but I think we just have to stay in there and keep fighting.
I agree. Just knowing all I know about history, the Black politicians that were elected during the Reconstruction era, what they risked. People had their houses burned, they were beaten, some of them were murdered, some of the local politicians. And if we had walked away from politics then we wouldn't have universal public schools. We wouldn't have the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. So we have to press forward in spite of it. Recently, I think in February, I did a talk, and the title is all I want to mention here. It was Rise Up and Risk Something Real. So to make many big gains in life, you have to risk something. So sometimes that risk might be your career. It might be something that you didn't think you should have to risk, but we have to risk it, even if it means, all of these personal challenges that we have to endure. I'm thinking of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was beaten in a Mississippi jail just for trying to register to vote. And if she were here, she would say, hell yeah, still run for office. Okay, we can't stop. Because that's what they want us to do. They want us to stop and to sit at home and not, get into the political sphere. So that's a wonderful question. And I know it seems, hopeless at times, but it really isn't. If you look at the longer arc of history, we've made a lot of progress.
Definitely. Barack Obama said in his speech, it was a Howard, I think, wasn't it? A few years ago, he said asked the students, said if you were to pick at any time in history to be young, gifted, and Black, you pick now. And I think that's really important. We've got to keep it in perspective, and that that things are hard. They're not what we wanted them to be right now, but we are so much farther along. And yes, we've backslid, but that always happens. And I see that I'm kind of a geek. I always try to, see everything in the most positive light. But I think this is, if you look at history, this is the backlash that you always see when real progress is happening. It always happens. And this means that the next time we move forward, we are really going to propel forward. And that's why there is this backlash. These people are terrified. And this is the last gasp. You're nodding. I'm glad you agree with me.
So
yes, I do. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
I think there's a lot of nodding going on out there. And that was very inspiring to hear you both answer that question. I have another question. This one is from Naira Stitt, who is a third year here at the law school, and she's also a social justice fellow. And this is for either or both of you. What do you think the role of the Black church is today in fighting suppression of the Black vote, if one still exists? I wonder if Black churches on the national, regional level still have the active role they once did, especially with younger Black voters being less likely to attend church or associate with local religious organizations.
That's a great question. I really like that question. And what she's touching on with this question is the declining political significance of the Black church. Most of our time in America, the Black church has been indispensable, especially as a political space, a safe space where we could gather. Talk about our issues, as I, stated before. But I think the Black churches, in order to really be relevant, have to return to the basics. And that is, I don't think that church can simply be just a religious space anymore. I think we have known that for most of our history, but sometime after the Civil Rights Movement, the Black churches, for the most part, with the exception of the AME, kind of just retreated. And they're not as political. When you look at the civil rights leaders, most of those people were ministers in their congregations, especially the SCLC, a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So I think the Black church has always played a role, but I think there is a declining significance. And I think ministers and members of congregation have to really probably return to those old models of history where you educate people in the church about issues. You have these lively debates within the church about these issues. It's not, a sin to talk about politics. It's not a sin to marry politics with religion, with feminism, with LGBTQ. All of those things we need to have a space and a safe space for that within our Black churches.
That's a great point about discussing those issues. And one thing I saw, I've often been involved with a voter turnout, GOTV, working with churches to do that. And one of the things I saw a few years ago when we were doing this, and especially with encouraging voter registration and having these big voter registration drives, was that, and there was this sense that the parties had of, we got to go to the churches, do the churches. And we'd come back and say, well, we're not really getting that far with the churches because they're all registered. Like, they had already done their drives. They had already, so when we would have our, big souls to the polls or souls on the rolls, we didn't have that many numbers to show because they had already done it. They were already engaged. But it showed me that we needed to do more, and the churches needed to do more, just like you're saying, that there are so many people who are not churched. They're not in the church, but they're right around the church. They're in the neighborhoods, they're in the communities. And I think the churches need to do more to reach out to those people because everybody can't get to them. For example, the political parties can't necessarily, they don't know who to talk to. These are people who are not, either they're not registered to vote or they're not on, in the polling information, but the churches know who they are. They're right there in their communities. And I think the churches and the ministers and the outreach people can be really helpful in not even just bringing people into the church, but going into the communities to help educate the citizens, because we find that most of the people who are already in church have a lot of this information already. They're not as educated. I think, Professor Taylor, you're right that there need to be these like really deep, much deeper discussions. But when it comes to just basic, registration and voting, they tend to, it's cliche, but you're preaching to the congregation. They already have that, but they can be really instrumental in reaching people who otherwise can't be reached, because that's a newer phenomenon in our society, I think.
And I think one other thing I was thinking about is that I think universities suffer in a different way from the same thing. Because Howard, now we're trying to return to our mission of social justice. And so I'm trying to design this social justice certificate. But the thing is, it's like there's always this kind of divide between the unchurched and the church, between the unlearned and the learned, meaning inside and outside of the academy. And I think we all of these institutions have to do better about raising the critical consciousness of people in our community, people who otherwise may not have the opportunity to participate in a very vivid and a lively political conversation. And so we just have to do better at that. Too often when I do these things, it's always professors and their students, and very rarely, people who are, maybe disfranchised because they're a felon, or people who are single mothers who may not ever get a chance to have, a dialogue with about the intersections of race and gender and poverty and all of those things. So I'm just thinking that all of these things need to be improved.
And you're exactly right. And that's why we have to go to where they are, because so many things, like voting, is fairly simple to us. It might be a little bit inconvenient, but if someone doesn't know how to do it, or their lives are complicated, that's a huge thing. Just getting the right ID, and they don't know what to do, and they're not going to go online and look up what they need. Or I remember going to someone's house on election day several years ago, and they sent us out as flushers, in a neighborhood that the turnout had been low, so they sent us out to get people to go out to vote. And this young woman, and she was registered to vote, but she said, I can't, I got to go to work. But and then I said, well, we'll drive you to the poll. Well, and then she had a little kid. Well, what's going to happen to her kid? It turned into this huge negotiation. We ended up getting her to go. We watched her kid, we took her to the polls, we watched her kid, and then took her to work. But it was one of those things that made me realize that life for people is really, really complicated. And just going down the street on election day to vote was really more than she could even wrap her head around, and she needed help doing it. And I don't think we think about that enough when we're trying to encourage people to be more engaged. We don't really think about what their lives are like and how we're very fortunate, we're very privileged, and we can do it, and maybe we can take a couple of hours off of work, but it's not going to affect whether or not we can pay the rent, because we're not going to lose money going, we're not going to risk getting fired. And now it's even more complicated. People are afraid of COVID. They're afraid of, so we've got to be much more mindful of what people's lives are like and meet them where they are.
All the more reason to have election day off or to vote, at times when, it should be like a national holiday. Our faculty actually just voted to cancel classes on election day so people could not only go and vote and not worry, but also go and work polls and observe and do things like that. Someone sent a comment in that I think is really worth reading. And then there's one other question I'll follow that with. So the comment is, I hope she doesn't mind. It's from Ann Hubbard, who is on our faculty. And she says, and she worked in North Carolina, I think, in politics for some time, but she says, it's also worth remembering that voting rights were not always so partisan at the top. The VRA was renewed repeatedly with broad bipartisan support. Back in the day, 1980s in North Carolina, when the Republicans announced ballot security squads in predominantly Black precincts, we could call DOJ and get voting rights lawyers on the ground the next day. Now DOJ is leading or directing voter suppression. This gives me hope that a new administration can turn this around, which I think is a great point. But I also wanted to make sure I asked this question from Haley Harris, who's a first year here at the law school. She thanks you both for speaking today, and she asks, how do you think we can course correct, put a spotlight on some of these Black female figures in the civil rights movement, i.e. Ella Baker? Should it be through history classes, or is there another route where we can focus on the work these women did?
Wow, I love that question. Of course, I'm a little biased. Of course, it should be in history classes, but unfortunately, not everybody has the opportunity to take a lot of electives while they're pursuing their bachelor's degrees. But I think at this point that Black women's history, women of color history should be fully integrated into the curriculum at all levels. And so just like, Kristen Cosm, who's teaching feminist jurisprudence, things like that. Like, it doesn't really, take that much effort. There are women in these various sectors who have that expertise. And so, but other than that, if you have the opportunity in college, for the college students that are there, take these courses. I think Professor Carolette Norwood teaches Black women in sociology. I'm not sure that there's anybody doing that in the history department anymore, but you could put pressure on them to hire somebody to do that. And like I say, it should just be, a natural integrated part of most courses.
And I think it's a little unfair also to expect academia to bear the full burden of that. I mean, this is a cross society issue. Academia, of course, plays an important part, but I think in whatever endeavor you're in, whether you're practicing law or you're making movies or you're doing, you're out in the community doing anything, I think it's important to build those stories in. I think we need to have those stories told, and it needs to happen everywhere. So I'm saying that because I don't want people to think that we need to just turn to the history professors. I'm trying, to say, well, what are you going to do about this, or you should do more, and we should all be doing it. And I think academia can provide a tremendous basis for that, because you want to make sure we've got our history right, and you've got the information correct. And there's such a rich, my gosh, there's a treasure trove of people and stories. And I mean, any one of these stories are, I was just telling someone yesterday about when my dad first went to the NAACP. He was going into a brand new situation. And so Roy Wilkins, who was the president, wanted him to start off on the right foot. So he assigned him his own secretary, his administrative assistant, because she knew everything. This was Mabel Smith. She had been there for years. She had worked for Thurgood Marshall. She had helped like with the Brown briefs. She just knew everything. And he said, she'll get him started on the right foot. He was there for 10 years. She never left. They stayed together the whole time. And he relied on her so completely. And he was just in awe of her. And he said, if she were a man, she'd have been president of the NAACP. Her story, she died about 15 years ago. Her story's never been told, and I just wish more people knew about people like her and knew what she knew. I mean, if she had written a book, she was a fly on the wall for everything. And there's so many stories like that. And a lot of these women are still alive. A lot of them aren't. But there's Mildred Bond Roxborough at the NAACP, who actually worked very closely with Mrs. Smith. And she's in her 90s, but she's been there forever. And she knows all kinds of things. And I know she's been featured in some documentaries and some other things. But I think I think if, we need to get to these women who are here and get their stories and tell those stories and encourage other younger women to follow in their footsteps.
Yeah, I think you're right. Not only are those stories, hidden from most of us, but even when we have the names of some of our giants, like Rosa Parks, the public memory about her is all twisted and messed up. A little old lady who was tired one day after work. This woman was phenomenal. She had been involved in activism against rape and the Recy Taylor incident. And Rosa Parks was anything but just an accidental activist. And in fact, her leadership style, her insight is one of the things that helped galvanize not just the Montgomery bus boycott, but all the other things that she was involved in after that. She was fearless. She believed in armed self-defense. We have had the wrong idea about Rosa Parks. So we all need a re-education, I think, at every level, not just civic education, but education about women's history, education about American history that is more inclusive and correct, and less, just a collection of stereotypes and mythology.
Yeah. Yeah, we Disneyfy these people, I see that happening to John Lewis. He was, the gentle, he was so sweet. He was yes, he was a very sweet man, but he was fearless. Rosa Parks was fierce, like you said. And, but they turned them into these milquetoast figures who bear no relation to who they really were. Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions? I'm trying to look at the chat.
Yeah, well, I'm going to jump in here. This is Kristen, and you both just did what I was going to ask you to do, but I'm going to ask you to do it again. So this conversation has been wonderful. I want to say Carolette Norwood just typed in the chat. The summation here is, as Angela Davis's book is entitled, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And I agree, that's a very apt way to talk about a lot of what we're talking about today. I wanted to conclude, I'm totally putting you on the spot, but I know this is not going to be a problem, especially for Stephanie. One thing I love about Stephanie is anytime we get together, I leave with like 15 anecdotes that stay with me forever. And so kind of in the as a way to talk about some of these powerful women. And I'm just thinking in response to a couple of our students' questions who, these are those young women who are going to go out there and make a difference. But these are times when it can really be questioning, is it worth it? Can I do it? Very aware of what the costs were. So I was wondering if each of you could possibly tell a story. It can be historical or from your personal experience about a woman who has done something that is inspirational to you, that's had an impact in the political arena. And maybe we could conclude with those stories, if you have them.
Okay. Well, I'll say, and this may seem a little cliche just because of the timing, but the first person who comes to mind, there's so many women, of course, but the first one who comes to mind is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, and I think she's also one of these women we have to be careful that we don't Disneyfy. That she was more than the notorious RBG, which, she was. And I love the idea that she became this amazing cultural figure, this pop culture figure, toward the end of her life. But one of the things I think was very gratifying in the wake of her passing was that people did talk a lot about the work that she did as a young lawyer and the impact she had on all of our lives. And I think she's a great example of how I think when it's something my dad has always said is that if you do good, you will do well. And if you do the right thing and work toward justice, it can make a real difference to other people. And I think and her life turned out very well. She did just fine being a civil rights lawyer. And I think it's really important to help people understand, especially young minority lawyers, and especially young minority women lawyers, that becoming a social justice advocate, whether it's your career or whether you're using your skills in another, in some other capacity, that there is good in that, and it really makes a difference. Because I know I came along with a group of people who were, we considered ourselves pioneers. I guess we were, but we weren't pioneers like those who came ahead of us. But we were the first ones who getting jobs in law firms and in corporations, and a lot of people drifted away because the money is good, and and also everybody doesn't. It's like, why can't my life just be easy too? I don't want everything to have to be fighting for a cause. I'd like to go somewhere and make money and have a really nice life. But I always try to encourage people to, especially lawyers, to go into civil rights law and social justice, because first of all, you can have a good life. You won't starve, but you also will have fulfillment, and you will be able to see that you made a difference. And I think Justice Ginsburg is a good example of that. At the end of her life, when people really started talking, most people didn't really think about what she did as a lawyer. But when you realize that just about every woman in America benefited from what she did, and not just women, men also, in fighting for equal rights and justice. And I think it's a really important lesson to learn, that you can do really good, and you can do a lot of good, and then you will be fine, and you will end up in the right place. I think my dad was a perfect example of that as well. That if you make the right choices and do the right things, you will end up on the right paths. And so I leave it at that.
Thank you. And so mine, I hardly ever, my students are sick of me talking about Ida B. Wells, but I can't get enough of her. And she is my absolute favorite person in history, bar none. She was born in the 19th century, lived in segregated Memphis at a time when Black people were being lynched Her consciousness was raised when her friends who owned a store were lynched. So she got involved in the movement. The movement back then was anti-lynching and trying to get integration, trying to challenge segregation. I'll put it that way. But Ida B. Wells, in every aspect of her life, in every aspect, she fought against the system. She was a teacher, so she tried to raise and elevate the consciousness of young people. She also was a journalist, and she was so good, they called her the princess of the press. So she documented and wrote about lynching. So she was a teacher, a journalist. She brought a lawsuit against a railroad system or railroad company back when Black people were not doing that as much. So she challenged them against her horrible treatment on a railroad car, and she won. Okay, a lawsuit, and she won. She actually fist fought with one of the conductors on the train who tried to dismiss her as a Black woman and put her in a car with smokers. And she says, no, I'm a lady. I'm not going to be in that car. And I paid my ticket. And so, she was feisty in that way. She is the only Black woman founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. People always talk about Du Bois, but Ida B. Wells was at the table too. In addition, she fought for women's right to vote, and she also was one of the singular people who helped to dismantle the institution of lynching. She went abroad, had an international campaign against lynching. So Ida B. Wells is tremendous. The second one that I keep mentioning here because she's pretty significant, although very few people know about her, her name is Ella Baker. And Ella Baker is the one who trained Rosa Parks. Ella Baker was the one who started talking about women's rights even within the civil rights organization. She had a problem with the hierarchical nature of social activism and the organizations that were male-centered, very hierarchical. Her and Dr. King had some little struggles, but Ella Baker is the only one that believed that students, young people, could make change. So she was there with the students who were doing the sit-ins, and she helped to found SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which arguably is one of the organizations that shifted the game for the civil rights movement. She brought those young people to the table. She gave them a voice. That organization, unlike all the other civil rights organizations, was non-hierarchical. She believed everybody had a voice and should be there in the leadership circles. So those people, those are two. And so I hope they give you some inspiration.
I am so happy I asked that question. Those were excellent answers. And I think especially now, those stories need to be told also because they're inspiring. We need to be inspired. I'm really happy to say that the Jones Center is going to be working with Stephanie and her organization to get our students involved in some of this more get out into the community.
Kristen, you're muted.
Hold it. I got muted by somebody else. So did you hear me say how much I loved your stories? Yes. Yes. Okay. And we want to thank you so much for being with us today. I think part of why I was muted is because I've asked if all our attendees could actually become unmuted so that we could all give you a heartfelt round of applause. So everyone can join me. I think we can hear.
Thank you. Thanks for those.
All right, now everyone has to be muted again. All right, so thank you everybody who joined us. If you want to send any messages to either one of our speakers, if you put it in the chat, they will see that. I know people have come on and they've stayed on for an hour and a half listening to this really informative conversation. If anyone has any questions or any follow-up about wanting to know what additional things you might be able to do to work against any voter intimidation or work to help protect the vote, feel free to reach out to our center. And thank you very much for joining us. And everyone have a nice weekend.